Good afternoon, everyone. Today, in our series of short lectures on economics and the Bible, we're going to discuss the book of Revelation and its critique of what we might call economic imperialism, or the economics of empire. Now, I know that the book of Revelation has a bad reputation. It can be difficult to understand, and in our time, it has been interpreted in some very unhelpful and harmful ways. Yet, Revelation is part of the Christian biblical canon, and if we read it carefully, I think it has some interesting wisdom for us today. Let's begin with some background. The book of Revelation is the last book in the New Testament, and probably the last to be written as well. According to the book's opening lines, its author is a Christian named John, living on the Greek island of Patmos due to his testimony about Jesus. Most scholars believe John was writing in exile under the rule of Emperor Domitian due to some of the symbols that John uses. He addresses the book to the 7 churches in Asia, that is, the Roman province of Asia, or Asia Minor. These churches were probably not facing widespread persecution, as some think, but they were tempted to embrace the culture and values and idolatry of the Romans. The literary genre of the book is an apocalypse, which is derived from the very first Greek word of the book, apocalypsis, which we translate as revelation in English. Now, while apocalypse has come to mean the end of the world, this is not the original meaning of the word. It is actually related to a verb that means to reveal or to uncover. An apocalypse is a narrative featuring often a heavenly tour guide, like an angel, revealing the underlying struggle between God and evil forces. Rather than a playbook describing the end of the world, the book of Revelation provides readers a way of seeing reality in light of God's activity. In other words, it's a lens to see what's really going on. One of the primary images John uses in his apocalypse is a corrupt place called the Great City. What is the Great City? On one hand, John speaks of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified, this last location being Jerusalem. These are all places where God's people have been victimized in history. On the other hand, John most frequently calls the great city Babylon. And in addition, there are clues within the text that reference the city's 7 mountains, for example, that suggests that John was referring to the empire of his own time, Rome. So which is it? Is it Sodom, which God destroyed after its residents did not show hospitality to strangers? Is it Egypt, whose armies God destroyed after Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites? Is it Babylon, who brought the Israelites into exile before God used Cyrus the Great to defeat them? Or is it Jerusalem, the place Jesus was crucified and the place that was sacked by the Romans in 70 CE? Or perhaps John is speaking about his own lived experience under Rome, the empire of his time. The answer to this question is yes. The great city is a portrait of all of these places, as well as any place that defies God through oppression and domination. In other words, the great city is a model of empire. In fact, some of these places in the Hebrew Bible functioned much the same way. Sodom became the prototypical city that warrants God's judgment due to its wickedness. Egypt became a place of oppression, and also escape through the Red Sea was a crucial memory for recalling God's miraculous saving power. At the same time, John primarily calls the great city in Revelation Babylon, which makes sense because the destruction of the temple that is, and the exile to Babylon in 597 BCE was one of the most defining events in the history of Israel and led to the creation of the Bible itself. The memory of this painful event was incredibly formative for the self-conception of ancient Jews. Here's an analogy to help better explain what John means by Babylon, and the analogy uses imagery from Star Wars. We could imagine that the individual locations John mentions are like the lone Star Destroyer in the original Star Wars movie, Episode 4, A New Hope. Sodom, Egypt, Babylon, and Jerusalem were all oppressive in their own way and in their own time. Yet John's Babylon is like a whole fleet of Star Destroyers in Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. The Empire cannot resist rising again and again until it grows to infinitely large proportions and must be contended with in a cosmic reckoning between good and evil. The point is that all of the lone Star Destroyers were ultimately just some facet of this whole larger fleet. This fleet is John's Babylon. Now that we have a sense of the great city of Babylon as a model or archetype of empire, let's take a closer look at John's depiction of Babylon. John imagines Babylon in two ways: as a woman, the great whore or prostitute, and as a city, the great city. There are reasons why this pairing makes sense that would require an additional lecture to really explain properly, but in short, in John's ancient patriarchal context, writers often personified cities as women because both women and cities were seen as vessels that could be penetrated. John employs this deeply misogynistic metaphor here. Now, the woman is called the great whore or prostitute and is depicted as alluring the kings of the earth to be her clients through her lavish appearance. She is clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. On the other hand, Babylon, the city, is actually depicted in almost the exact same way, clothed in fine linen in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. The only difference is the addition of fine linen. We might imagine that they're hanging from the banisters of the city. The point here is that Babylon is characterized by luxury and by economic excess. Now, the core of John's economic critique in Revelation is found in chapter 18. This chapter begins and ends with speeches given by angels, heavenly agents, but in the middle comes a series of laments by groups of people. Here he describes the fall of Babylon, but instead of describing the destruction directly, he uses an ancient literary technique to describe the city's fall from the perspective of those watching from the outside. In the core of this chapter, verses 9 through 19, there are three groups of mourners that share their perspective: kings, merchants, and seafarers. Each group reveals what they lose as Babylon falls. Now, as you can see, John's writing here is highly organized, and there are parallels between the different parts of the laments that help reveal each group's particular concerns. There are two main sections of these laments. First is an introduction, and then the words of the lament song. The introduction announces the group of people lamenting, and in each case there are some shared elements. The speaker is doing some combination of weeping, wailing, and mourning, and in addition, the speaker stands far off at a distance from the destruction. We can imagine that even as these groups are crucial players in Babylon's economy, they have the privilege to lament its destruction from afar. The kings and seafarers both witness the smoke of her burning, and that's a reference to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis. After the introduction is the lament song, and the song is divided into three parts. The lament begins the same way in each case. Alas, alas, the great city. The word alas or woe comes from the laments of prophets in the Hebrew Bible who call out injustice and oppression, and the word is used in Revelation to do much the same. But here, the mourners are not lamenting injustice, but the loss of what they had gained from their dealings with Babylon. In the second part of the lament song, each group mourns the loss of something unique to them. We'll come back to this a bit later. And finally, in the third part of the lament song, all three groups make a remark regarding how fast Babylon fell in 1 hour. How could Babylon's demise come so soon? Isn't this the great city? To answer this question, let's take a closer look at the relationship between each of these groups of mourners and the city or woman of Babylon. First, the kings. They have the most intimate relationship with Babylon and related entities. The kings collude with demonic forces, they pledge their allegiance to the beast, and they commit sexual immorality with the woman Babylon, even as they are tasked to destroy her. Notice that all of these activities amount to structuring and maintaining power. Earlier, we discussed how each group of mourners had their own unique lament. The king's lament is Babylon, the mighty city. See, the kings lose the power and strength that comes from their close ties to Babylon. Next, the merchants. They are more directly involved in the inner workings of Babylon's economy. They grow rich by selling luxury goods, goods that satisfy their soul and help them find status as magnates or mighty men of the earth. Accordingly, their unique lament is the loss of a city clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. The merchants are devastated when they lose access to luxury and opulence during the fall of Babylon. And finally, the shipmasters and seafarers, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, they stand at even further distance from the destruction and lament over the city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For the seafarers, the fall of Babylon means the loss of their wealth and prosperity. Notice that the kings, merchants, and seafarers all have different roles, trading and selling in Babylon. And so John is describing a whole economic system, a web of trade deals and shipping routes that transcend mere individual occupations. It is a system that is subject to God's judgment and falls under its own weight. Now, amid the laments by the kings, merchants, and seafarers, John also includes in the middle more details about the economy of Babylon through an extensive list of 29 trade goods. This is actually one of the longest lists of Roman trade goods in ancient literature. The goods are grouped into different categories, including precious metals and gems, textiles, building materials, and cooking ingredients. And at the end of the list comes livestock, supplies for war, and then the final climactic element, slaves and human lives. These last two items comment on the entire list. It is the selling of slaves, who are actually human lives, that make the rest of the economy possible. In the Greek, the same word for lives of the slaves here is used to describe the soul of the merchants in the very next verse. And so what John is doing is drawing a contrast between the soul of the economy, hungry for luxury, and the soul of exploited human persons that enable this luxury. Note that John, though, is not contemning luxury goods. After all, the most prized items on this list appear in the description of the coming heavenly Jerusalem. Instead, John is describing an economy fundamentally built on injustice and oppression, and an economy that is subject to God's judgment. Now that we've taken a closer look at the details, let's finish by taking a step back to observe the portrait of Babylon that John paints for us. First, Babylon is an archetypal empire. While John often has Rome in the backdrop of Revelation, he also wants us to have eyes to see Babylon as every city, nation, or society that defies God through its misuse of power and through its tendency to oppress. Next, Babylon is an economic enterprise where buying and selling happens. And it is also systemically sinful, meaning that the corruption here transcends mere individual actions, but is found within the systems of the city, particularly its economic systems. These systems are also oppressive. They generate luxury for some at the expense of others, and particularly through the buying and selling of enslaved human beings. Yet, Babylon is also unstable. Despite its greatness, it falls quickly in just 1 hour. For all the ways that Babylon is corrupted, it is judged by God and turned over to be destroyed. And so finally, Babylon is fallen. John reveals that this sort of corrupt, sinful, and unstable society will meet its end. The city's shareholders will lament, and God's people are called to rejoice. This is John's critique of every empire throughout history and provides a lot of questions for us to ponder in our own time. What is underneath the so-called greatness of an empire? Who is being exploited by our economic structures and who is making a profit? And most importantly, how do we live under imperial economics? Thank you, everyone. I welcome your questions.